The war had ended, or so the world believed. Cities lay in ruins, millions were displaced, and the victors promised peace at last. But beneath the rubble of the Second World War, another struggle was already being born, one colder, quieter, yet no less dangerous. It did not begin with armies storming beaches or tanks roaring across plains. It began in the shadows, with secret missions, hushed conversations, and desperate hunts for knowledge more powerful than any bomb dropped in the war just ended. Hollywood would later paint the Cold War as a chess match of spies and missiles, but its first sparks were not on movie screens. They were in the ashes of defeated Germany, where American, British, and Soviet soldiers raced to capture the minds and machines that could decide the fate of the future. The world thought the war was over. In truth, it had only changed shape. Before we dive deeper into the forgotten origins of the Cold War, make sure you subscribe and share this journey. Because the stories that shaped our world are not just history, they are the blueprint of the present. And only by remembering them can we understand the dangerous roads we walk today. The war in Europe was officially over. The streets of Berlin were silent, except for the crunch of boots on rubble, the smoke of ruined buildings curling into the sky like funeral pyres for a fallen empire. To many soldiers, it felt like the end of the world they had fought through, a world of firestorms, blitzkrieg, and endless graves. Yet for the men who picked their way through bombed-out bunkers and abandoned factories, there was no sense of closure. Victory did not mean rest. It meant a new hunt, one that could decide the fate of nations before peace had even taken root. Everywhere, the shadows of Nazi Germany concealed more than ruins. Beneath collapsed hangars lay half-finished aircraft unlike anything the Allies had flown. In hidden warehouses, prototypes of jet engines rested under tarps, their sleek shapes whispering of speeds never seen in combat. Underground tunnels revealed machine tools, stockpiled parts, and blueprints for rockets that had leapt into the skies above London only months earlier. The Reich had been defeated, but its science was still alive. Waiting to be seized by whoever found it first, American patrols moved quickly, guided not only by maps, but by intelligence briefings marked urgent. They were told to capture scientists, to secure laboratories, to take control of records before they were destroyed. Trucks rolled out of the forests, loaded not with prisoners, but with filing cabinets, strange alloys, and boxes of documents written in technical German. For the first time in the war, the soldiers' rifles were not their most valuable weapons. Their discoveries were. At the same time, the Soviets advanced from the east with equal determination. To them, the ruins of the Reich were not just trophies of victory, but a vault of knowledge. They stripped factories bare, loaded trains with equipment, and marched engineers eastward under armed guard. They knew what the Americans knew. The future of war, perhaps the future of the world, was buried here, in these charred laboratories and cracked blueprints. The hunt was frantic, almost chaotic. One week, American troops might discover a hidden cache of advanced aircraft designs. The next, Soviet scouts would capture a convoy carrying physicists who had worked on uranium research. Each side watched the other closely, even as they still called themselves allies. There was no trust now, only suspicion. The war had united them against Hitler. His defeat left them staring at each other, already calculating the next conflict. Among the ruins, the ordinary soldiers felt the strangeness of it all. They had fought through Normandy, the Ardennes, the Rhine. Now they were told to guard warehouses, filled with unfamiliar machines. Some held rocket parts, still reeking of fuel. Others contained stacks of documents so technical that even the officers could not understand them. There were whispers of laboratories that had tried to split the atom, of scientists who had sketched weapons that could burn entire cities in seconds. For men who had survived artillery and machine guns, the idea of something even worse was chilling. There was also a human side to the hunt. Scientists, engineers, and technicians who had served the Reich now found themselves bargaining for survival. Some surrendered eagerly to the Americans, hoping for leniency. Others hid in farmhouses or tried to flee westward before the Soviets could catch them. Their knowledge was their only shield. Men who had once built weapons of terror were now treated as prizes, not prisoners. Soldiers who had seen comrades fall under German fire now stood guard over German engineers, instructed to keep them safe. It was a bitter irony, but war had never cared much for fairness. The scale of discovery was staggering. Hidden airfields yielded jet-powered Messerschmitts that looked more like spacecraft than planes. Submarine pens revealed designs for vessels that could stay underwater far longer than anything the Allies possessed. And deep in the Harz Mountains, American troops stumbled upon the Mittelwerk tunnels, where the V-2 rockets had been assembled by slave labor under horrific conditions. The smell of damp earth and death still clung to the walls, a reminder that every innovation carried a human cost. For the men who entered those tunnels, it was impossible to ignore the contradiction. On one hand, they were seizing the future, machines that could reach the edge of space, engines that broke the limits of speed, weapons that defied imagination. On the other, they were walking through a graveyard, where thousands of prisoners had been worked to death to build those same machines. It was the perfect symbol of the moment. Triumph built on suffering, progress entwined with horror. In those ruins, the seeds of the Cold War were already sprouting. Each side gathered what it could, not to share, but to hoard. Not to rebuild peace, but to prepare for the next great contest. Soldiers who thought they had survived the last battle of the war did not know they were witnessing the first moves of a new one. The world had celebrated victory, but in the shadows of the Reich's ruins, another conflict had already begun. Long before the mushroom cloud rose over Hiroshima, another weapon had already rewritten the future of war. The V-2 rocket. It was not just a bomb. It was the first machine to cross the edge of space and then plunge back to Earth at supersonic speed. When Hitler unleashed it in 1944, Londoners heard only a faint whistle before entire city blocks vanished in fire and debris. Antwerp, Brussels, and Paris felt its terror too. Unlike aircraft, there was no warning siren, no defense, no chance to fight back. The weapon came from nowhere and killed without mercy. Yet for all its horror, the V-2 was not perfected. It was a weapon rushed into combat, costly and inefficient, more psychological than strategic. Still, it revealed something extraordinary. If man could send rockets into the sky, he could go further, higher, faster. That realization made the V-2 program the single most coveted prize in the ruins of the Reich. Whoever controlled it would control not only the future of weapons, but perhaps the future of space itself. As Germany collapsed, Wernher von Braun and his team of engineers understood their position. They were no longer loyal servants of the Reich. They were bargaining chips in a new war. With the Soviets closing from the east and the Americans from the west, von Braun gathered his staff in the Harz Mountains. He urged them to surrender to the Americans, calculating correctly that life in US hands would be preferable to Soviet captivity. It was not ideology that guided him now, but survival. American troops advancing through Bavaria soon encountered the engineers, thin and weary, but alive. Alongside them were crates of documents, blueprints, and pieces of rockets. Von Braun himself had broken his arm in a car crash, but still negotiated calmly, presenting himself not as a defeated Nazi officer, but as a visionary scientist. To the US officers who realized what they had stumbled upon, it felt like seizing the crown jewels of modern warfare. At the same time, Soviet forces reached Peenemünde, the birthplace of the V-2. The test stands were shattered by Allied bombing, but much remained. Rocket parts were loaded onto trains, along with any scientists the Soviets could capture. In their zone of occupation, factories and workshops were stripped bare. Entire production lines were dismantled and sent east. What the Americans did not secure, the Soviets claimed with ruthless efficiency. Thus began the race. In the West, Operation Paperclip quietly transported German engineers to the United States. They were given new identities, sanitized records, and laboratories in the desert. Von Braun would eventually lead the team that put Apollo astronauts on the moon, but in 1945 his task was simpler: to turn the V-2 into an American weapon. In the East, the Soviets forced captured engineers to replicate the rocket under military supervision. Within a few years, both superpowers had not only inherited Nazi technology, but were pushing it further than the Reich had ever imagined. For the soldiers who had fought through Normandy and the Ardennes, it was a strange sight. Men who had built weapons that killed their comrades were now flown to safety, dressed in American uniforms, and housed with their families under protection. Many asked the same question: how could this be justice? The answer, whispered in corridors of power, was blunt. Justice was less urgent than survival. If America refused these men, the Soviets would not. The Cold War had no patience for morality. The rockets themselves were disassembled, shipped and tested in the New Mexico desert. Cameras recorded their thunderous launches, smoke plumes rising against the clear sky, engines roaring with a sound few had heard before. Soldiers watched as machines built for destruction now served as stepping stones to exploration. The contradiction was staggering. The same weapon that had fallen on London became the foundation for satellites and space travel. The same engineers who had built tools of terror would now shape humanity's path to the stars. For the Soviets, the process was harsher, but no less ambitious. German engineers worked under guard, often in secrecy, rebuilding the rocket from memory when documents were missing. Soviet officers demanded results, and within years they had their own versions roaring from launch pads. The competition was not yet called the space race, but its seeds were here, in the wreckage of the Reich. The race for the rocket was not simply about technology. It was about control of the future. Both America and the Soviet Union understood that the next war might not be won with tanks and bombers, but with machines that flew higher than aircraft and carried warheads deadlier than anything yet imagined. The shadow of the V-2 stretched long, and in that shadow, the Cold War was already taking shape. By the end of 1945, the hunt for rockets had divided the Allies as sharply as any border. The common struggle against Hitler was gone, replaced by suspicion, secrecy, and ambition. The race for the rocket had begun, and it would end not in the ruins of Germany, but in a world where the sky itself became a battlefield. While rockets promised the future of warfare in the skies, another battle was already being waged in silence, a battle of words, codes, and shadows. During the war, Allied intelligence had cracked some of the most complex systems ever built. At Bletchley Park, British cryptanalysts had broken the Enigma and Lorenz machines, reading German signals with an efficiency that often turned battles before they began. In America, codebreakers tracked Japanese transmissions, paving the way for victories from Midway to the Philippines. These triumphs were cloaked in secrecy, their full power hidden even from many generals in the field. But when Germany fell and Japan surrendered, the work did not end. Instead, it shifted. The same networks that had once deciphered Nazi commands were now turned toward former allies, the Soviets. The irony was sharp. Only months earlier, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin had stood together as the Big Three, their armies fighting side by side. Yet even then, suspicions ran deep. Soviet diplomats had watched the Anglo-American partnership with unease, and British and American officials knew that Soviet intelligence was already burrowing into their institutions. When peace came, trust evaporated like morning fog. The same cables that once carried German orders were now monitored for traces of Soviet plans. The war of codes had never stopped. It had simply changed its target. Captured documents deepened the tension. As Allied troops swept through Berlin, they seized Gestapo and Abwehr files, revealing the breadth of Nazi espionage networks. But buried in those same files were hints of Soviet agents who had infiltrated Allied governments during the war. Codenames surfaced, pointing to leaks inside the very heart of the Manhattan Project, the program that had built the atomic bomb. Suddenly, victory felt less secure. If the Soviets already knew the secrets of the bomb, then America's most powerful weapon was no monopoly at all. And indeed, they did. Soviet intelligence, through agents like Klaus Fuchs and networks hidden within Britain and America, had passed along critical details of nuclear research. What had taken the United States billions of dollars and years of effort to achieve was delivered to Moscow through whispered conversations, dead drops, and coded cables. For the West, the revelation was shocking. For the Soviets, it was confirmation that their invisible war was already paying dividends. This realization reshaped intelligence forever. The wartime cooperation of Bletchley Park gave way to the rigid secrecy of the Cold War. Cryptographers who had once worked openly with allies now found themselves compartmentalized, cut off. Their work focused on intercepting Soviet signals. The ghost networks of World War II did not dissolve. They merely shifted allegiance. Former Nazi agents were sometimes even recruited, their past crimes ignored if their knowledge could be turned against Moscow. Morality blurred in the name of survival. For the ordinary people caught in this new shadow war, the consequences were profound. Letters were opened, phone calls tapped, and entire communities watched for signs of espionage. Scientists who had once been celebrated for their contributions to victory now found themselves under suspicion, their loyalty questioned, their movements tracked. The war had ended, but the atmosphere of secrecy, fear, and suspicion only deepened. In Europe, the struggle played out most visibly in Berlin. The city, carved into zones of occupation, became a nest of spies. Soviet officers courted informants in smoky cafes. American and British operatives slipped across darkened streets to meet contacts. Microfilms, codebooks, and whispered conversations became weapons as potent as tanks or guns. In those early years, Berlin was less a city of rubble than a stage for an invisible war, where every conversation might carry a hidden meaning, and every shadow might conceal an agent. The networks built during the war, from resistance movements in France to partisans in Eastern Europe, were not dissolved either. Many were reactivated, some willingly, others under coercion. Soviet intelligence exploited former underground fighters, while the CIA, newly created from the wartime OSS, sought to turn survivors of German occupation into allies against communism. Old loyalties blurred. Men who had once fought side by side now served different masters, and through it all, the Cold War deepened. New machines were built, capable of processing vast streams of intercepted signals. Mathematicians who had once cracked Enigma now wrestled with Soviet ciphers, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in secret rooms filled with endless clatter of typewriters and punched cards. The ghost of Bletchley Park lived on, not as a monument to victory, but as the foundation of a conflict that would never be declared and never truly end. By 1946, it was clear that the war of intelligence had become the Cold War's first battlefield. While armies demobilized and weapons were mothballed, the invisible war only grew sharper. No peace treaty could end it because it was not fought with soldiers in uniform. It was fought with whispers, numbers, and shadows, and in those shadows, the Cold War was already consuming the world. When victory parades rolled through New York, London and Moscow, the world celebrated the defeat of fascism. Flags waved, bands played, and the crowds believed justice had been served. But behind closed doors, a quieter, darker chapter was already unfolding. The victors, who had promised to hold the guilty accountable, were making choices that bent morality into something unrecognizable. The men who had built Hitler's war machine, the scientists who designed rockets, jets, and chemical weapons, were suddenly too valuable to punish. They were being hunted, yes, but not for trials in Nuremberg. They were hunted for recruitment. The United States gave its secret program a name: Operation Paperclip. It was bland, bureaucratic, even harmless sounding. But in reality, it was an operation that smuggled more than 1,600 German scientists and engineers into America, many of whom had worked directly for the Nazi regime. Some had worn the uniforms of the SS. Some had overseen slave labor in underground factories like Mittelwerk, where thousands of prisoners died assembling V-2 rockets under brutal conditions. On paper, these men should have faced judgment. Instead, their Nazi affiliations were carefully erased from records, literally covered with paperclips, holding false biographies to their files. Werner von Braun, the man who had led Hitler's rocket program, became the centerpiece of this bargain. To many, he was a visionary who dreamed of space exploration, but the truth was messier. He had designed weapons that killed thousands of civilians, and his rockets were built by prisoners who starved, froze, or were beaten to death in tunnels carved through the mountains. Yet in the logic of the Cold War, his past was secondary. What mattered was his knowledge the Soviets were also desperate to seize. The Soviet Union was no less ruthless in its pursuit. Their own program, less publicized, swept up thousands of German engineers and scientists, moving them east to secret research centers. Families were uprooted, entire design bureaus transplanted behind the Iron Curtain. In Siberia and Moscow alike, German scientists were placed under heavy guard and ordered to rebuild their work for a new master. Many had no choice. Cooperation meant survival. Refusal meant disappearance. For both superpowers, the moral compromise was clear. They could not allow the other side to seize an advantage. If America hesitated to use German expertise, the Soviets would not. If the Soviets hesitated, America would not. And so the victors who had condemned Nazi crimes in courtrooms were simultaneously erasing those crimes in laboratories. Justice was sacrificed to the calculus of survival. The contradiction was staggering for soldiers who had fought and bled in Europe. Men who had seen comrades die under V-2 bombardments now learned that the very engineer responsible was being flown to safety in Texas or New Mexico, given a new home and a salary. Families who had lost sons to Nazi science discovered that those same scientists were building rockets for America's future. The truth was kept quiet, hidden from the public, wrapped in layers of classification. But within intelligence circles, the knowledge left a bitter taste, and yet the results were undeniable. In the United States, the imported German scientists laid the foundation for the Redstone and Saturn rockets, the very machines that would one day send astronauts to the moon. In the Soviet Union, their captured experts helped accelerate the development of missiles that could reach across continents. Both sides, armed with this expertise, transformed their wartime rivalry into a technological arms race that defined the Cold War. The moral bargain was never openly admitted, but it hung over every achievement. When von Braun stood beside President Kennedy and promised a moon landing, few spoke of the tunnels at Mittelwerk. When Soviet rockets thundered into the sky, few mentioned the German engineers who had been forced to work in secret behind barbed wire. The past was inconvenient, and so it was buried beneath the triumph of progress. For the men who made the bargain, the justification was simple. Survival demanded it. The world was no longer about justice for the crimes of yesterday, but about preparing for the threats of tomorrow. To hesitate was to lose. To lose was to risk annihilation. And so morality was set aside, replaced with a colder logic. The logic of the Cold War, born from ruins and secrecy. Operation Paperclip was more than a program. It was a symbol of what the new age would demand. Choices that blurred the line between right and wrong, victories bought at the cost of conscience, and futures built on the bones of the past. The war was over, but the bargains made in those years ensured that the shadows of World War II would haunt the Cold War from its very beginning. The victory celebrations of 1945 painted a picture of peace, but that peace was already cracking. Beneath the cheers and waving flags, the world was dividing into camps, each armed not only with weapons, but with the secrets stolen from the ashes of the Reich. The war's end was not a conclusion. It was a turning point. What followed was a new kind of conflict. One fought not with massed armies clashing across continents, but with suspicion, proxy battles, and a constant threat hanging in the skies. Berlin became the first and most vivid symbol of the new struggle. Once the heart of Hitler's empire, the city was now carved into zones of occupation, a patchwork of American, British, French, and Soviet authority. But cooperation quickly dissolved into hostility. Soviet troops stripped factories and rail yards, hauling away everything from locomotives to light bulbs. In the western zones, American officers tightened control over resources, determined to rebuild Germany in their image. Each side eyed the other across ruined streets. Allies turned into rivals overnight. The city itself became a battlefield of whispers. Spies slipped through alleys, radios crackled with coded signals, and children scavenging for coal sometimes stumbled upon discarded documents meant for intelligence hands. In 1948, the confrontation turned open with the Berlin blockade. The Soviets cut off all land routes into the western sectors, hoping to starve the Allies into submission. It was the first great test of wills in the Cold War. Instead of retreating, the Americans and British launched the Berlin airlift, sending cargo planes into the sky day and night, delivering food, coal and medicine to a city of 2 million. For nearly a year, the air above Berlin was filled with the drone of engines, each flight a declaration that the West would not yield. When the blockade was lifted, it was clear that the Cold War was not a passing tension. It was here to stay. At the same time, the shadow of the atomic bomb loomed larger than any battlefield. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had shown the world a power beyond comprehension. The mushroom cloud was both a symbol of victory and a promise of annihilation. At first, America believed it held a monopoly, but Soviet intelligence, fed by spies within the Manhattan Project, ensured that monopoly was short-lived. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The world entered a new era, one in which destruction could come not in days of battle, but in a single hour. The arms race began in earnest. Rockets captured in Germany were now being tested on American deserts and Soviet steppes, their thunder echoing across landscapes far from the ruins where they were born. Soon, nuclear warheads were mounted atop missiles that could reach across oceans. The logic of warfare shifted. It was no longer about seizing ground or storming beaches. It was about deterrence, about convincing the other side that a strike would bring only mutual ruin. The balance of terror became the uneasy foundation of peace. Meanwhile, the ideological front lines hardened. In 1946, Winston Churchill declared that an iron curtain had descended across Europe, dividing free nations from those under Soviet control. Stalin tightened his grip on Eastern Europe, installing governments loyal to Moscow. The United States responded with the Truman Doctrine, pledging to support any nation threatened by communism. Money flowed through the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe. But behind the generosity was strategy. Economic strength was a weapon as vital as any bomb. From Greece to Korea, from Berlin to the halls of the United Nations, the Cold War spread. Soldiers who had expected to go home after victory now found themselves redeployed, not against Germany or Japan, but against a shadowy new enemy: communism. Veterans of airborne drops in Normandy were now stationed in garrisons in occupied Germany. Pilots who had flown bombers over Europe now trained to deliver nuclear weapons. Scientists who had once designed tools of liberation now calculated the mechanics of annihilation. Through it all, the ghosts of the Second World War lingered. The scientists brought over in Operation Paperclip worked in American labs, their pasts obscured by new uniforms and new missions. In Moscow, captured German engineers completed their assignments before vanishing into obscurity or imprisonment. The spies who had betrayed wartime secrets lived double lives, some eventually unmasked in sensational trials, others never discovered at all. The moral compromises, the secret missions, the theft of knowledge, all were woven into the fabric of the new struggle. By the early 1950s, the line between war and peace had blurred beyond recognition. Children in schools practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under desks as if thin wood could shield them from nuclear fire. Families built fallout shelters in backyards. Newspapers printed maps showing missile ranges. Fear became part of daily life, not the fear of enemy soldiers at the border, but the fear of invisible rockets and bombs that could end the world before a warning could sound. And yet, in a strange way, the Cold War also carried forward the dreams born in the ruins of the Reich. The rockets once designed to terrorize London carried satellites into orbit. The scientists who had built weapons of mass destruction helped launch humanity into space. The competition between America and the Soviet Union pushed technology forward at a pace no peacetime rivalry could have matched. Out of fear came innovation, and out of rivalry came progress, though always shadowed by the threat of destruction. The secret missions of the war's final days had started it all. The hunt for rockets, the scramble for scientists, the race to steal secrets, these were the sparks that lit the Cold War. What began in the tunnels of Mittelwerk, in the corridors of Bletchley Park, and in the alleys of Berlin, became a global struggle that lasted nearly half a century. The world had been promised peace in 1945, but what it received instead was a colder, quieter conflict, one that reached into every home, every government, and every shadow. The story of the secret mission that started the Cold War is not just about stolen rockets or smuggled scientists. It is about the choices made when victory blurred into rivalry, when morality bent before survival, and when peace proved to be only another battlefield. The soldiers of World War II had fought to end one war, only to see their triumph become the foundation of another. The Cold War was not born in speeches or treaties. It was born in the ruins, in shadows, in secrets, and in bargains struck when the world was too tired to notice. And in many ways, we are still living in that world. The rockets, the spies, the mistrust between great powers all remain with us, echoes of the war that never truly ended.